Hi everyone, this is Kenna Magana, one of the District Instructional Specialists for ELA. Today we are going to start our series on having a writing revolution in your classroom. So why writing revolution? This is called the Hockman method. This method is rooted in research. It aligns to the instructional shifts in ELA that we've spent a lot of time talking about over the past couple of years. It builds students' comprehension by beginning with grammar basics. You can apply this to any content area at any grade level, so it's really multifunctional. The Hockman method begins with sentences, the basic building blocks of writing, then progresses to outlines, paragraphs, and compositions. We know if our students can't compose a strong sentence, they're not going to be able to compose a strong writing. So spending some time working on developing those powerful sentences is really going to help our students take their writing to the next level. So let's dive in. You want to start out by going over the 4 different sentence types with your students. I know this isn't something that we've spent a lot of time on in the past few years. However, it's really important for this method to be effective. So for the purpose of this series, we're going to refer to the 4 sentence types as statement, question, exclamation, and command. Of course, you can go over the true names with your students, but for this series, we'll be referring to them as those. So why teach the sentence types? This is going to enable our students to vary their sentences. We know that that's one indicator of strong writing if we see different sentence types. It also introduces students to forming questions. That's going to be important in just a few minutes. It also becomes an effective strategy for creating topic sentence and concluding sentences. We know students' writing needs to start off strong and it needs to end strong. So here's an example of how I would use this in my classroom. I've introduced my students to the 4 sentence types. We've spent a little bit of a mini lesson talking about those 4 sentence types, seeing examples of it, calling those out in our writing. And then I give my students this text to read, The Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And I want to see how well have my students been practicing, how much have they learned about the 4 different types of sentences. So I would give them this quick little exit ticket. This can be done in a Google Doc, in Google Forms, or you could do it on a little half sheet of paper for your students, whatever you feel comfortable with. So I'd give my students the 4 complete sentences that you see on the right, and I would have a blank beside it to the left. And I would ask my students to go through each of those sentences and identify which one is the exclamation, which is the question, which is the statement, and which is the command. And if you notice with the command, it ends in an exclamation mark. That was very intentional on my part. I want my students to remember that commands might end in a different punctuation, but that does not mean that they are an exclamation just because it has an exclamation mark at the end of it. They need to really understand what a command is and how it is used in writing. So remember I told you developing questions was important? Here's why. We need our students to develop questions about what they read. This is going to encourage them to think about important features in the text. It encourages close reading. They're really able to narrow in and be very specific and very precise with their reading. It encourages students to use precise language. So they identify that in their reading and they're able to utilize that in their writing. It helps our students take a deeper dive and a deeper look into the text that they're reading. Now, when I talk about developing questions, I'm not talking about just surface level questions. What color was Johnny's shirt? That's not important. I want my students to develop deep, meaningful questions about what they're reading or the text that they're looking at to be able to show me that they understand what that text is about. So here's an example. Let's say my students are starting their unit on the lost colony of Roanoke. I present my students with this image and I give them a few minutes to study this image very carefully. And I ask them to develop 3 questions based upon what they see in this image. Now, as the teacher in my planning, I have come up with some possible responses that I think my students are going to give me. I kind of narrowed it down to my top 3 responses. So after my students have spent time studying this image, I ask them to start sharing out their questions. So one question I anticipate seeing is, what is Croatoan? It's written right there, so they're probably going to be curious about, what does that mean? What is that? Why did the men have weapons? Were they afraid? Was there something there that they needed to be prepared for? Was it just a precaution? Why did they have those weapons? And another question I think that they might ask is, why did they look confused? So this is a great way to start this unit. It's allowing my students to analyze a piece of art, but they're also focusing their learning. These are some questions that as they go through their unit of study, they'll be able to answer. But right now, we're just developing these questions. That's okay. After my students have dove into their unit of study, they've read multiple texts, we've engaged with multiple texts, we've done a lot of work, and I want to see what my students know. I also want to see, how can my students develop questions? How do they do that? Are they developing those deep, meaningful questions, or are they just short, irrelevant questions? So I'm using this assessment to test for 2 things. So I give my students these 2 answers, Croatoan and the lost colony. And I ask my students to develop 1 question for each of those answers. Now, I know what you're thinking, Mrs. Magana, I don't like my students to write their answers in just 1 or 2 or 3 words. I want complete sentences. I do too. However, for this exercise, that's not what's important here. I don't want to give my students too much information because I really want to test and see what they know. So I'm only going to give them a short little piece of the answer and see what they come up with for their questions. So there is a time and a place for these short little answers. So based on my students' responses to this, I'm able to see, did they understand what they read? Have they understood what they've been learning? And I'm also able to see, are my students able to develop the right questions? So why is that important? Well, developing questions leads to better comprehension. When my students get to that expository writing at the end of the school year, or at the end of our unit, and they see their writing prompt, I want them to be able to write a very well composed response. So my students are given the writing topic, explain how the United States acquired the Louisiana Territory. I want their minds to automatically come up with the question, how did the United States acquire the Louisiana Territory? I want that to be what pops into their mind. If I'm practicing developing questions in my classroom, and this is a regular routine practice in my classroom, I'm not saying this is something we're doing all day, every day, but this is something that my students are very familiar with. It's part of their learning. This is going to come naturally to my students. So when my 5th graders get to the question, justify the importance of taking action on ideas in the Templeton Twins have an idea, their little minds are automatically going to go to, why is taking action on ideas important in the Templeton Twins have an idea? They're able to give me a strong writing piece based off of their ability to develop a question. So my 4th graders, they've been reading about hurricanes, and then they're told to describe how one experiences a hurricane firsthand. I want their little brains to start churning out the question, what are hurricanes like firsthand? That's going to give my students what they need to be able to write a really good piece. That's not everything that they need, but it's really setting them off on the right foot. So now let's talk about building some powerful sentences. Here's how I would introduce this to my students. We have these three powerful words in the English language. They're called conjunctions. These words, because, but, and so, allow us to take our writing to the next level. They allow us to give the reader a little bit more information. And when we're the reader, we're able to get a little bit more from the author. So the word because, that tells why. I was tired because I didn't sleep well last night. The next word, but, it shows a change of direction. I wanted to go play outside, but it was raining. And the last word, so, it indicates cause and effect. It was raining, so I put on my rain jacket. Those three powerful words are going to help me build some really powerful sentences. So that's how I introduce it to my kids, that quick little mini lesson, and then I give them the opportunity to practice. So we've been reading the third grade unit because of Winn-Dixie. So I tell my students, we've been working with our three powerful words today. I want us to take those three powerful words and use it to talk about the story we've been reading because of Winn-Dixie. So I give them the sentence stem, because Winn-Dixie does not look healthy because, and I ask my students to complete that sentence. I give them the other sentence stem, Winn-Dixie does not look healthy, but, and ask them to complete it. Winn-Dixie does not look healthy, so, and ask for my students to complete it. Now on the screen, you'll see that these are some responses that I'm hoping to get from my students. Now I might have students that are not ready to practice with all three of these yet. We might need to break it down and we might need to just focus on one at a time. So instead of focusing on all three, I might just start with one. Just start with the first one. And I say, okay, class, this is what we're going to focus on today. Our powerful word, because. And we're going to look at how that works in our text and how we can make it work in our writing. So we just focus on that one. And then we add the second, and then we'll add the third. So we build our students up. You can truly differentiate with this method for the needs of your students. Now here's an example from the upper grades. This is 8th grade Flowers for Algernon unit. I might want to see my students show me multiple perspectives of what they've read. So in this text, there's multiple characters in here. And let's say the second sentence stem. Charlie feels normal, but. And I may ask my students to kind of generate as many responses as they can to that sentence stem. Charlie feels normal, but others do not accept his changed self. That's a very broad statement, but I could ask them to narrow that down. So specifically, Miss Kenyon, how does she feel? If Charlie feels normal, but what about Miss Kenyon? What does she feel about Charlie? So I can give my students these sentence stems, either one or all three, and ask them to utilize them to complete the sentence. It's also important to note that when I feel my students are ready, I don't have to give them the sentence stem. I could tell them, I want you to write me 3 sentences, and each one has to use one of our powerful words. And let your students show you what they have learned based off what they've read using the conjunctions that they've been learning about. So here's another example. This is how we could differentiate it for our students. So I give my students this article. It's about the garment factories in New York and how there were a lot of fires long ago. There were very unsafe working conditions. And there were, several fires that happened and a lot of people died. But there was one fire that really was a catalyst for change. So my students read this article. I may have some students that need some additional support. So I provide them with the sentence stem, many women died. And I ask them to complete the given sentence using because, but, and so. Now, I have other students who are doing a little better. They don't need that extra support of the sentence stem. So I would just tell those students, I need you to compose 3 complete sentences using our 3 powerful words, because, but, and so. So it's really easy to differentiate with the Hockman method to support the needs of all the learners in your classroom. Once they have mastered their 3 powerful words, I'll let them know there's another way to say it. With the 2 words but and so, we have some alternative words that we could use. With but, we could use although, while, even though, however. On the other hand, all of those would show a change of direction. And with so, the words therefore, as a result, consequently, and thus all show that same cause and effect relationship. So I give my students that little mini lesson. We talk about it. We identify where we see it in our writing. Then I want to show you why teaching this is important. Written language structure. It's important for our students to understand that there's a structure to the written language, and they can learn more and more and more and just continue to develop that structure. It also helps develop complex sentences. We go from those really basic sentences to these more in-depth and complex sentences. And we know that's a mark of our students improving with their writing. It also improves and checks reading comprehension. If a student is not able to truly articulate what they're trying to say in that sentence, maybe there was a breakdown in the comprehension of what they read, and they need to go back to that text, or they need to be provided with some additional supports for that text. It also boosts vocabulary development, and it's a strategy for creating a topic sentence and a concluding sentence. Again, that comes up. It's important that our students are starting their writing with strong sentences and they're ending their writing with strong sentences. So I've taught my students about subordinating conjunctions. I did a little mini lesson, and I want my students to show me what they've learned. We've been reading about Athens and Sparta, and I want my students to truly give me a breakdown of what they've read. So I give them the 3 sentence stems that you see here, and I ask my students to complete those. So the first one, although Athens had a direct democracy, the response that I desire to see from my students, the most correct response would be only males born of citizen parents could participate. And sentence 2, while Athens valued educators, Sparta focused on building a powerful military. And then sentence 3, since Sparta feared Athens' growing power and prosperity, Sparta declared war on Athens. So I start out by giving my students those sentence stems to work with. That's going to give them the support they need to work with these subordinating conjunctions, because they are a little bit more complex than just regular conjunctions. Once our students have mastered using the subordinating conjunctions, have the students construct full sentences using the subordinating conjunctions. So don't give them the sentence stems. Just let them know that you want them to compose 3 different sentences using 3 different subordinating conjunctions, showing what they've learned. There's still room for differentiation here. If you have some students that might need a list of the subordinating conjunctions, you can certainly give that to them. So there's definitely room to ensure that all learners are supported in this process. So we've been talking about creating topic and concluding sentences quite a bit in this presentation. We talked about it in the sentence types. We just talked about it with subordinating conjunction. And the third is appositives. An appositive is a noun phrase, or noun clause placed next to another noun to rename it or explain it more fully. So I would talk to my students about what an appositive is and what the purpose of an appositive is. I would show them some examples of appositives. I would show them here on the board. See this first sentence. Frederick Douglass, a passionate abolitionist, was one of the country's most influential champions of civil rights. And I would let my students know that the appositive in this sentence is a passionate abolitionist. And then I would say, okay, let's do this next one together. Esperanza, the narrator of the house on Mango Street, wishes for a home of her own. Well, if an appositive tells us more about the noun, then, okay, we see Esperanza there. That's a noun. Well, what tells us more about Esperanza? And they're able to identify that that's the narrator of the house on Mango Street. Okay, so that's an appositive. Then I would have them work with their partner. Let's look at the third sentence. Many plants and animals live in the rainforest, an environment where rain falls almost every day. What's the appositive in that sentence? And then, as a little exit ticket, I would maybe give them the last sentence for them to work on independently to see if my students are truly understanding what appositives are. So that way I can see where I need to adjust my instruction. So why teach the appositives? Well, that also helps with the written language structure, and it helps our students vary their sentence structure, something we want to see in strong writing pieces. It adds information and complexity, and it improves and checks reading comprehension. It encourages careful reading, and it's a strategy for creating a topic sentence and a concluding sentence. We want our students starting their writing strong and ending it strong. And it's important that our students understand how to use these pieces of writing to help improve not only what they're writing, but what they're reading, their understanding of what they're reading. So here's something that I might have my students do. My students are reading The Giver, and I want them to practice using appositives. So I want them to brainstorm some possible appositives that would work in this sentence. So Jonas blank experiences several changes throughout the story. So they come up with 6 different options of what they could use. And then I ask them to pick which one they think would best help someone who has not read the text, what would help them best understand who Jonas is in the story. So for someone who's never read The Giver, the most important thing that they would need to know about Jonas is that he's the protagonist in that story. That would help them understand kind of where they're going with that story. So while it is true that Jonas is an 11-year-old boy and he is the new receiver of memory, if I had never read the text before, me knowing that he was an 11-year-old boy or me knowing that he was the new receiver of memory really wouldn't mean that much to me. So then I would have my students practice using appositives. I would give them a topic and I would tell them to write a sentence with an appositive. So I give them Lady Macbeth, and I want them to tell me who Lady Macbeth is, tell me about Lady Macbeth, and I want you to make sure you use an appositive. So a response that I anticipate from my students is Lady Macbeth, a ruthless woman, goads Macbeth into killing the king. Okay, that's a great job. A ruthless woman. That tells me a lot about Lady Macbeth. That tells me a lot about that character. If I want to know about Duncan, I want my students to tell me who Duncan is, write a sentence telling me who he is, use an appositive. So that way, if I had never read Macbeth before, I would know who Duncan is. I would know the most important thing about him. So Duncan, the King of Scotland, decides to make Malcolm the heir to his kingdom. So me knowing that Duncan is the King of Scotland is really important for me understanding the story of Macbeth. So give your students multiple opportunities to practice. Make sure that they are identifying the most important pieces because there's going to be more than one correct response. However, we want the most correct response. So spend a few minutes talking about that with your students. So that brings us to the end of our first session. I'm so glad you joined me today. In our next session, we're going to talk about sentence combining, sentence expansion, And then we're going to start with that single paragraph outline. It starts with a sentence, but it moves to the outline. So that's what we're going to work on in our next session. The resources for this presentation, I use the resources I got in the training in the summer of 2020 by the Writing Revolution. I also use Judith Hochman's book, The Writing Revolution, and I've provided a link in the presentation for you so you can access that text and purchase it if you would like to. I found it really helpful in my study of the Hochman method and just learning more about what I was learning in the Writing Revolution training over the summer. Again, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, you can email me. My email is kmagana, Kmagana, @ebrschools.org. You can also follow me on Twitter, and that is @ELA Updates. And I look forward to seeing you at our next session. Thank you so much.